Welcome, everyone, to Society and Culture in Colonial America. Our time frame here, 1670 to 1756. Having taken a look now at Puritan New England and the Chesapeake, Virginia colony, we're going to consider more generally life in the English mainland colonies of North America. That is, those colonies that stretched along the Atlantic seaboard from what was the New England colony with its capital, Massachusetts Bay here at Boston, southward all the way to what was generally understood as Carolina, which eventually, of course, became North and South Carolina, with Charleston being the capital, the corresponding southern capital of South Carolina. Georgia would also be added as a colony. And so you can see the 13 colonies as they take shape here in this period, 100 years or so preceding the American Revolution, the period we call Colonial America. Keeping in mind now that the 13 colonies were part of a larger English colonial empire that took shape in these years, including not only the 13 mainland colonies, but the various island colonies of the West Indies as well as Canada, all part of a growing English colonial empire. The peopling of these colonies reflected the movement and migration of people across the Atlantic, mixing with, blending with, conflicting with the Native American population. During the 1670s, about 500 ships a year crossed the Atlantic Ocean, about 500 a year, while by the 1730s, that number had increased to about 1,500 a year. So a busy commerce of peoples and commodities across the Atlantic Ocean, upwards of 1,500 ships a year by the 1730s. And a majority of those coming, even to the English colonies, were not actually English. As William Penn, the proprietor of Pennsylvania, put it, the interest of England to improve and thicken her colonies with people not her own led to the invitation of colonial settlement, of commerce, and of course, as we also know, enslavement. That is, the various means by which people were making that transit across the Atlantic to the New World, or the purposes for which they were making that transit. So I think we should see the Atlantic here not so much as a barrier, but more like a bridge connecting the Atlantic world, Europe, Africa, with the Western Hemisphere. And it's into the Western Hemisphere, and particularly, again, the English mainland colonies, that these foreign populations of people are sprinkled in and amongst the various native peoples who, of course, already occupied the Western Hemisphere. It was in 1670 that wealthy English sugar planters from Barbados established the Carolina colony, which included the whole region that would later become North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Writing in 1666, Robert Horne said that Carolina is a fair and spacious province on the continent of America, while Eliza Pinckney seemed to disagree just a tad. Extremely disagreeable, wrote Pinckney. Excessive hot, much thunder and lightning, and mosquitoes and sandflies in abundance. So two very different descriptions of the Carolinas. One from Robert Horne, a promotional description meant to entice investors in what became the Carolina colony, while Eliza Pinckney, an actual resident of Carolina, writing a very different review. So mixed views on the Americas. The new people who were imported to the colony were, of course, coming from many different backgrounds, but the majority perhaps coming from a working class, laboring background of poor English, landless, propertyless, often indebted laborers. Now, the colony of Carolina was a swampy, heavily wooded backcountry populated by Indians and a few runaway servants from Virginia. Generous incentives, however, attracted landowners who earned head rights, that is, individual plots of land, for importing servants and laborers into the region. At least a third of the early Carolinians began as indentured servants as a result. So there was a great incentive, both on the part of the landowners to import laborers, and not just enslaved people, but keep in mind English indentured servants as well. Just as there was an incentive on the part of the servants to escape whatever entanglements may have befell them back home and to try for a new start in Carolina. Keeping in mind, of course, that the entire enterprise was predicated upon the expectation of profit. In fact, in the Colonial Charter, which established Carolina in 1663, the language was very clear, as well as to import from the said province of Carolina the several goods and commodities, that is to say, silks, wines, currants, raisins, capers, wax, almonds, oil, and olives, without paying or answer to us any custom, import, or other duty. In other words, seeing the merchantable commodities that could be derived from colonial settlement in the Americas exported to England with no trade barriers, no additional taxes for purchase and marketing in the English economy. And as we know, the importation of people to Carolina included growing numbers of enslaved Africans as well. In fact, in Carolina, it was going to be a particularly important stream of importation that would in fact ensure the Carolina colony's success and survival. That is the tragic fact that it was the arrival of imported African people, that is enslaved African people, by way of the Western Hemisphere, that is the West Indies islands of the Western Hemisphere, to the English mainland, largely because of the establishment of the rice crop as Carolina's preeminent cash crop, a crop in many ways indebted to the very being of African people. Crop was rice was a crop grown in Carolina, but as we know, a crop that was native to West Africa. And thus it was West Africans, by and large, who were responsible for its successful venture in Carolina, that is, enslaved Africans. So many, in fact, were imported to Carolina that one visitor to the colony said it looks more like a Negro country than a country settled by white people. This was also true because English settler folk did not fare well in Carolina. The climate, the semi-tropical climate at times, bred semi-tropical diseases like malaria, for example, which they had virtually no immunities to. So most stayed away from the lowland coastal plantation districts or the coastal island plantations, and instead a skeleton crew of overseers and owners mixed in with a burgeoning population of African people to make up the heart of colonial Carolina's rice economy. Carolina was the first of the English mainland colonies to support a black majority among its population. And by the year 1740, 43 million pounds of rice being cultivated. Europeans, Africans, and of course Native Americans making up part of the population matrix. According to historian Alan Taylor, traders shipped the treated deer skins to Europe, where they were made into bookbindings, gloves, belts, coats, work aprons, and hats. What's he talking about here? He's talking about the trade established between settlers from Europe and native peoples, that is, people native to the Carolinas and the Atlantic seaboard. And it was their relationship as traders, as exchangers of commodities, that will help the colonial economy grow. One of those commodities was deerskins, as historian Taylor suggests. Between 1699 and 1715, South Carolina exported an average of 53,000 deerskins a year, totaling about 30,000 pounds sterling in revenue. So, rather significant business stream here. That is the trade, the exchange of animal pelts that were secured mostly by native peoples at the behest of English traders, with often devastating results to the native population, of course, not only because of the admixture of disease, for example, that took such a heavy toll on native populations, but also because of the fundamental reordering of native ecosystems and economies. Because along with the deerskin trade came a gun trade, for example. The gun trade was the backbone of a raid and trade system that saw native peoples both ally with and fight against the English colonies and other tribal groups. There is not a sixth of the savages living within 200 miles of all our settlements as there were 50 years ago, remarked John Lawson. And what Lawson is referring to is the receding population line of native people who, when the English first arrived in the Carolinas, could be found throughout the territory in their villages, trading, hunting, but within 50 years' time, the pressures exerted by English settlement had resulted in the receding of the Indian population farther inland, that is, away from English settlements. And something like the gun trade, which initially empowered native people, particularly to hunt, but also to defend themselves or to war on others, the gun trade ended up causing native people a great deal of heartache because the English skillfully played off rival groups, and so warfare between tribal groups, particularly warfare arising from the various commodities trades, as native tribal groups would attempt to outmaneuver or outgain a rival in that trade. The introduction of the gun technology only led to more destructive and disastrous results for native people. It seems that Europeans and native people were on a kind of collision course, and the claims of empire were being exerted and maintained by force of arms, again from the Charter of Carolina from 1663. And because that in so remote a country and situate among so many barbarous nations, and the invasion as well of savages as of other enemies, pirates and robbers, to levy, muster, and train all sorts of men, of what condition or wheresoever born, to make war and pursue the enemies. This was a call to form militias within the English settlements, and to use the force of arms to assert and maintain colonial control over any population groups, be they native or what have you, who might seek to undermine that control. So a tradition of local defense and militia presence very early appears in these colonial settlements. And once again, the merchantable commodities that we've spoken of before, that is turning the New World into a kind of profit emporium, whereby native species of plants, such as the indigo plant, which could produce a brilliant blue dye, becomes part of a transatlantic trade now. Carolina's second biggest export by 1760, second only to rice, 500,000 pounds of indigo that fed the appetites and paid the expenses of an empire. The English Parliament passed the so-called Navigation Acts, which were meant to bring exclusive to England the trade products of the Americas. Though often unenforced, the Navigation Acts are a great example of how England's imperial reach across the Atlantic was meant to turn their colonies, that is, the English colonies, into revenue producers for the mother country. For most colonists, life in the mainland of North America was rural and labor-intensive, and in many places, up to a third of the population had arrived as indentured servants, including more than 50,000 convicted felons. It recalls the statement in an earlier lecture that America was a sink to drain England of her filth and scum. Remember the social and cultural conflicts back home due to the fluctuations of the English economy and a growing population left many poor and indebted and landless and tempted to turn to crime. So the colonies become a kind of escape valve for this population. Certainly few of those coming could afford to buy land outright, and most went into debt. Only about 5% of the mainland colonists lived in cities, for example, and the largest city in the colonies had a population that was still under 30,000. And slavery, while heavier in the southern plantation colonies, as we've seen, was nevertheless legal and existed everywhere throughout the 13 colonies. 3 times as many Africans imported to British colonies in the Western Hemisphere than free immigrants, for example. What does that do to the story that we tell our children of early America? That early America was a land, a bastion of freedom, of religious toleration and liberty, except that most of those who were coming were too poor to enjoy much formal liberty. In fact, 3 times as many were enslaved as came of their own volition. So, yeah, very different picture. The labor of Negroes is the principal foundation of riches from the plantations, observed one English visitor in 1718. The colonial population contained a tremendous diversity of mostly non-English peoples. And in a country like Pennsylvania, people were confronted with unprecedented diversity. We're talking now about not only people, English-speaking people, but Europeans of every stripe, along with Africans. Esther Wertland, a Swiss immigrant commenting on her new home in Pennsylvania in 1736, wrote, "Here are religions and nationalities without number. This land is an asylum for banished sects, a sanctuary for all evildoers from Europe, a confused Babel, a receptacle for all unclean spirits, an abode of the devil, a first world, a Sodom, which is deplorable." So Esther Wertland's view, none too praiseworthy, one might say, is she, of the Americas, of the English colonies, struggling with diversity, we might say, early in American history. Well-positioned colonists, on the other hand, reaped most of the benefits of the Atlantic world trade, and as we saw in the Chesapeake lecture and elsewhere, styled themselves a New World gentry class. Here's William Byrd of Virginia, a planter, a slave owner, who we have quoted before, and his colonial estate known as Westover, which set the tone for colonial opulence. So not only great diversity, but a kind of growing class divide between the few who were empowered by wealth and land owning and slave owning, and the great majority who struggled, who scrambled to find a means of subsistence. Among the gentry, a new behavioral mode, you might say, or cultural style called gentility, as in gentry, as in gentlemen. Gentility, defining the cultural high watermark in early colonial America. One wealthy colonist took great delight in his own consumption, but criticized that of commoners, claiming, quote, "If luxury was to be confined to the rich alone, it might prove a great national good." This idea that the wealthy were to enjoy the fruits of wealth while the laboring population, the majority population, not not attempt to be in any way an imitation of the rich. There were even laws passed called sumptuary laws that prevented laboring people from taking on airs and dressing above their means, confining them to certain styles of dress, for example, so as not to confuse the rich with the poor. And certainly the higher standard of living for the property elite was visible. A revolution in consumer goods transformed daily life throughout the Atlantic world, including the English colonies. From home styles, the so-called Georgian homes, which were characterized by their size and openness and brightness. Here you see this sort of wonderfully painted red door situated in an archway of white. There was this sort of detail that gave identity to the Georgian culture of the age, named for the King of England at the time. A place where you could enjoy the indoors. If the elements were often hostile in this rather rustic frontier setting of the English mainland of North America, then nevertheless the inside could be quite refined, almost as refined as any gentleman's home in England. Here the so-called Hanover House from South Carolina, built in 1716, shows all the luxurious appointments from the handcrafted furniture, the chairs, the fine ceramics, pottery, the great portrait above the fireplace, the inlaid features of the walls, the great carpet on the floor, the wood flooring, all of it bespoke wealth and opulence that set apart the rather tiny elite of empowered landowning, slave-owning, commercially successful class of gentry, set them apart from everyone else. Interestingly enough, women were at the forefront of a kind of social and cultural transformation here, because it meant that women now, as wives and daughters within the gentry class, offered more opportunities than ever before to stylize the home, to outfit the home, to equip the home in a domestic manner. Increased consumption offered women, even of middling means, multiple benefits, including reducing their labor as a means of self-assertion and authority within the home. So in some homes, having domestic servants take upon the labors that the housewife might otherwise have to bear. Now, of course, this was an option available only again to the relative few. In his autobiography, Benjamin Franklin cited the English proverb, quote, "He that would thrive must ask his wife. He that would thrive must ask his wife," in describing his wife's expensive purchases, often made without his knowledge, said Franklin, because she, quote, "thought her husband deserved a silver spoon and china bowl as well as any of his neighbors." So an interesting comment, almost a keeping up with the Joneses here among the propertied elites in the colonies. Having the right bowl, the right serving at a dinner party, for example, to maintain one's reputation as genteel. And defining the rules of new rituals in which proper manners, conversation, dress, and furnishings, as I say, became markers of status. A great example of this was the tea ritual. Tea was a distinctly gendered ritual, as women gathered to drink tea as a form of socialization and also as a means of displaying their wealth and manners. So sort of mimicking the English gentry class and the English commercial class, which had developed the afternoon tea as a sort of distinctively English cultural event. Despite the wishes of the elite, the complex trade economy also connected the common colonists across the Atlantic. Rather than living as isolated, self-sufficient yeomen, commoners also began to seek new niceties that marked a genteel lifestyle. During a 1744 tour of the colonies, Alexander Hamilton scoffed at seeing fine goods in the homes of commoners, remarking, quote, "He found superfluous things which showed an inclination to finery, such as a looking glass or the painted frame, half a dozen pewter spoons, and as many plates, and a set of stone tea dishes, and a teapot. So Hamilton, not to be confused with the more famous later Alexander Hamilton, Hamilton, an early visitor to the colonies in 1744, was rather put off by the fact that sometimes in what he considered to be rather ordinary homes, such fineries might be displayed, as if again people did not understand their place in the social hierarchy and wished to be seen as perhaps above their station. This consumer revolution of the 18th century, as some historians called it, as I say, could involve commoners, which was the source of much consternation on the part of the gentry class. These commoners incurred debt in order to enjoy the appearance of prosperity, something that ought to be very familiar to us living in the 21st century. American colonists consumed about 10% of British exports in 1700. By 1772, that figure rose to about 37%. So increasingly, colonists were purchasing back the finished goods that had either been made from New World materials or simply exported from England, purchasing these finished goods so as to decorate their homes and to decorate their lives. Colonial stores, often featuring display windows, helped to fuel the proliferation of consumption. So early habits of window shopping, common in colonial cities and towns. Despite the appearance of prosperity that consumer goods often provided, poverty was a common element of colonial life. So back to the reality that wealth was really for the minority, the tiny elite, while poverty and labor was the lot of the majority. One colonist observed in New York in 1765 that, quote, men frequently owe their wealth to the impoverishment of their neighbors. To put it simply, prosperity did not extend to everyone. In Boston, poor relief expenditures doubled between 1740 and 1760, which gives historians an insight now into the socioeconomic condition of the colonies, a growing number of poor being supported on the so-called poor rolls of Boston. Imperial wars, rising unemployment, and vulnerability to the boom and bust cycle of the transatlantic economy led to a growth in urban poverty. But that inequality also extended to the frontier, where prospects for laboring people of getting ahead or making it rich were poor indeed. We sometimes imagine that the frontier was a place of genuine and general equality, but if it was, it's probably because people were generally and equally poor. For those unable to buy or inherit farms, at least, this was the case, and many poor people were forced into permanent tenancy or headed west to fight the Indians for frontier land. As one American farmer wrote, flourishing as we may appear to a superficial observer, yet there are many dark spots which, on due consideration, greatly lessen that show of happiness which the Europeans think we possess. The number of debts which one part of the country owes to the other would greatly astonish you. So, a complicated portrait, you might say, of life in colonial North America. Certainly a great importation of different peoples from Europe, from Africa, most of whom found life difficult and laborious, and whose dreams, if they had any, of riches were either deferred or denied, while a relatively small part of the population, a minority, you might say, of the population that found itself on the winning side of the ledger, that is, as landowners, as slave owners, as commercial people, could enjoy a rather high standard of living and even supported a culture of refinement that we call gentility. But they were the few, not the many, and the many would continue to struggle for subsistence, either as slaves, as servants, or as landless poor trying to scratch a living out of the soil and acquire a few acres of land. Native peoples also figured into the matrix, as we saw, much to their detriment, seeing population figures decline, population lines recede. and even the trade opportunities ultimately coming back on them in some very negative ways. So, a first look here at life in colonial America. This is one of 3 lectures we're doing as we preview American history before the Revolution.